So from the very beginning, by which I mean the very beginning, there's been this undeniable connection between human culture and the human desire to become like God. So in Genesis chapter 4, right after Cain kills his brother Abel, we get this line of characters who are the fathers of human culture, the original culture builders. You have Jubal, the father of musical instruments, the arts. You have Tubal-Cain, the inventor who introduced like this technology of bronze and iron. And then you have Cain, who founded the first city. It is no surprise that as you go through this list, that these geniuses, and they truly are geniuses, these geniuses of human culture are in fact evil geniuses. Their names are synonymous with godlessness, polygamy, greed, division, violence, and so on. There is an undeniable connection between human culture and the desire to become like God. So Genesis chapter 2, we get this picture of the deep, rich fullness of life. And it is a garden planted by God. And yes, there are humans there, but there is no human culture. In fact, there's not even human clothing yet. But by Genesis chapter 4, the pinnacle of violence, sexism, injustice, anxiety, depression, division, fear, dehumanization is a city, not a garden. A city built by men who want to become like God. So it's not hard if you just pay attention to see this ancient theme of this connection between human culture and the drive to become like God. To see this everywhere. Just earlier this month, a corporation, a technology corporation in line of Tubal-Cain, became the first corporation in the history of the world to be valued at $3 trillion, with a T, trillion. And what happens to be the symbol of this world-shaping, culture-making empire? Well, it just happens to be an apple with a bite taken out. It just happens to be the symbol of the forbidden fruit, just happens to be the symbol of the human drive to make ourselves to become like God. Now, I am not saying that the iPhone is satanic, although it probably is. Like all great temptations, it's much more subtle than that. But it is not difficult to see wherever you stand in this. It is not difficult to see how the rise of this immense culture-making multinational company is born of this ancient human urge to become like God. Again, no surprise. No surprise. Culture and the desire to become like God go hand in hand. But what is surprising is that when you come back to this garden and city paradigm, when you go to the very end of scriptures in Revelation chapter 21, when God saves humanity, saves our world, redeems our world, makes all things new, when we are to live with him and be with him forever and ever, it is not a garden, it is a city. Well, there's a garden inside the city, but it's a city. Now, how odd is this? God doesn't build cities, God plants gardens. Humans build cities. In fact, cities, that's what they are. They are human culture. Cities are that place, that point, the very space where what we make of creation is greater than creation itself. But the vision of life with God is not a garden, it's a city, which suggests God will redeem human culture, which suggests God is redeeming human culture. That he won't just throw it all away and take us back to a garden. He will redeem what we've done in our arts, our technology, our education, our work, all things that we've used to escape him and replace him. He's actually going to somehow reach in and redeem them, integrate them, make them into his kingdom. It is fascinating. But this leaves us in this tension between Genesis and Revelation, between the garden and the city of God. Here today, human culture is undeniably if not the primary tool of the devil, and the place where we will one day live with God forever. Human culture is fundamentally broken, bent in on itself, and God is redeeming it. The city is the symbol of human rebellion against God, and God is calling us to a new city There's an overwhelming tide of culture sweeping over us, and yet there's an unstoppable work of God in the midst of it. It is both. So the question comes in, the ancient question, how do you walk with God? The way Adam and Eve walked with God in the cool of the evening. How do you walk with God in the city of men, the city of Cain, the city of human culture? The people of God have struggled with this, like I said, since the beginning. Think Lot and Noah. So in the Middle Bronze Age, the ancient Israelites struggled with the question, like, how do you live as the people of God in the land of Canaan? In the Roman era, it was literally like, if they hear you say Jesus is Lord instead of Caesar is Lord, they might actually kill you. Today, we wonder, how do you make it through our world without losing your faith? Is it even possible today? Is it possible to raise kids who actually carry on the faith, who know and love Jesus? Like, how do you follow Jesus in a modern suburban America? And in a previous generation, this question didn't pack so much punch. American culture was largely Christianized, meaning culture and Christianity went hand in hand in so many ways. We usually refer to that as Christendom, but if you haven't read the newspapers lately, that's a thing of the past. We now live in a thoroughly post-Christian era, so Christianity no longer holds a privileged position in the Western world, even though core values of the Western world are still Christian. Love, human rights, freedom, justice, the value of the individual, all of these are pulled directly from the Christian scriptures, and yet they are now divorced from the scriptures, divorced from the authority of God or Jesus or anything like that. And this makes things so much more complex. So with the Canaanites, with the Romans, there was a cleanness to it all. Like, do you worship Baal or do you worship Yahweh? Will you say Jesus is Lord or Caesar is Lord? And we will kill you, whichever one you say. Like, it's not easy, but it was clear. Today, cultural pressure is much more subtle and complex. It is secular rather than religious. It is post-Christian rather than pagan, and it hides in and under explicitly Christian values like love, justice, and the like. So 5-6 years ago, my son, who was at the time kindergarten, first grade, I'm not exactly sure, 5-6 years ago though, he comes home with this book, and he's still learning how to read. I mean, it's some books. So his sister, 2 years older, big sister, was a good big sister. She sat down on the couch with him. She was going to read this library book that he brought home. She was going to read it to him. And she's sitting there reading it to him. And then she gets to this point where it says, and Johnny was a transsexual. And I'm in the other room. I'm like, wait! I run in. Hey, let me see that book. Let's talk about this book. Now listen, I know these conversations are important. I know that the scriptures have been used to oppress people. I know that issues of gender have been used as a weapon even against some of you. I know that the people who put this book into my son's library and into his hands did it motivated by justice and love. So I'm not saying we shouldn't reevaluate the ways we view gender in light of the person and work of Jesus. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that my kindergartner probably isn't equipped to do that yet. I'm just saying that when you put this book into my kid's hands and he brings it home and he reads it, it starts feeling a lot like propaganda. In the name of Christian values of love, justice, human rights, our culture is intentionally reprogramming our children and all of us to see reality through a secular, post-Christian frame. So the question comes, how do you raise kids to know that Jesus is Lord in a world that says all authority claims are actually an act of oppression? How do you believe God in a world of skepticism and unbelief? How do you live in neighborhoods flooded with consumerism, individualism, and lust without drowning in the same? How do we walk with God in the city of men? Now, typical of God, when you ask him a direct question, he doesn't give you a direct answer. He instead tells you a story or a series of stories and visions. He gives us the book of Daniel. So the book of Daniel, it's this story or collection of stories of these few Hebrew exiles from the 6th century BC who lived. They were assimilated into the city and culture of ancient Babylon. They serve the Babylonian government. They live among Babylonians, and yet they manage somehow to keep their identity as the people of God. Somehow they cling to their faith. Somehow their faith grows. It doesn't shrink or diminish. And so for the next couple of months, we're going to be studying this book chapter by chapter. But in order to go where we need to go over the next weeks and months, I thought it might be helpful to give you an overview, an orientation of sorts, so that we can start to wrap our minds around this framework that Daniel gives us of the world. The book of Daniel cleanly breaks into two halves. So the first half, chapters 1 through 6, is history. It's stories about, if you grew up in Sunday school or watched VeggieTales growing up, you might know this. It's Daniel in the lion's den. It's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And for this reason, if you open up a Hebrew scriptures, if you go to your synagogue and take the Hebrew scriptures, you will find the book of Daniel listed among the writings. Not among the prophets, but among the writings, like Ezra, and Nehemiah, and Esther. It's history, so that's where the Jews categorize it. And yet, the second half is decidedly different. It is prophetic. It is prophecy. And this is why in our Bibles you will find the book of Daniel listed among the major prophets, among Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. However, if you do any type of research, you will find that there's more than these two categories of history, prophecy. You will find that Daniel is also called apocalypse. The apocalypse comes from the Greek word apocalypto, which loosely translates unveiling or to reveal. We tend to associate apocalypse with the book of Revelation and end times and the zombie apocalypse. But it's not inherent in the term. There's nothing about zombies in the term apocalypse. That just means revealing or exposing or seeing behind something. So apocalypse is an unveiling. It's pulling back the curtain so that we can see what's really going on, so that we can see the world the way God sees it, so that we can see what's happening in and under and behind the scenes. Daniel does that. So history, prophecy, apocalypse, these three readings are going to be necessary for us to make sense of Daniel, but I want to push this further. I think it's necessary for us to make sense of our world, our lives, our time. And so for that reason, I want to spend a whole Sunday unpacking these three ways of reading Daniel and reading our lives so that we can orient our hearts and our minds as we prepare for these stories and these visions. History, prophecy, and apocalypse. Now, if you're watching the clock, you'll notice history takes me a much longer time to get through than the rest, so don't freak out if this isn't going to last 3 hours. History. Now this, I was first introduced to the history of the book of Daniel by a guy named Dr. Y. Dr. Y, we attended church together in college, and he was this small, unassuming Asian man. He looked remarkably like the key maker in the Matrix movies. Anyways, so totally unassuming guy. I just thought he was a nice little guy. And then, a couple years into knowing him, I realized that Dr. Y was Dr. Edwin Yamauchi, the internationally famous Bible scholar who was the lead translator for Ezra and Nehemiah in the NIV and could sight read more than 26 dead languages. I was like, oh. So I got to know him and I got to check out some of his books and got to talk to him about, he wrote books on ancient Persia and archaeology and stuff like that. And I'm telling you, if you want to get into this rabbit hole, you will get lost forever. The time of Daniel, the 6th century BC, is an era that is filled with like larger than life personalities. It is filled with opulent wealth and earth-shattering battles and just, it's epic in every way. There are these kings who literally believe that they descended from the gods. It's fantastic. So, in order to orient ourselves, let's start with a bit of historical geography here. Let's pretend this is the ancient Near East, north and south, all right? So right in front of me, you guys live in the promised land. Right in front of me, right? I'm standing in the Mediterranean right now. This is the promised land. There's Israel on the northern part and Judah in the south. It's all the nation of Israel, but they divided early on. So anyways, so there's two halves of that. It's the promised land. Now this, it doesn't seem that special. It's small. It's like the size of New Jersey. And not special like New Jersey. But this seemingly nondescript land is a place of inexpressible significance to the people of God. And I didn't quite appreciate this till I went to Israel with some rabbis in 2018. And it is, it's impossible to separate the promise from the land. They refer to themselves as a people of the soil. Like that land is home. No matter where they're from, that's where they're from. That is home. And this is the place where God swore to Abraham that he would give this land. This is where God's holy name resides. This is where God chose to place his temple. This is where God's kingdom is meant to be established forever and ever and ever. But it's small. It's minuscule. It's just this tiny little place. And then wait down there, Tucker. This would be to the south. This would be Egypt, of course, and you guys know Egypt, right? I don't have to go into that. Pyramids and pharaohs and 400 years. God's people lived in captivity there, and then Moses led them out, and they came through the wilderness, and then they finally came into the promised land. That's over there. Egypt remains a world power for thousands of years. Very, very important in ancient Near Eastern world. And then way over there to the north by the door, that's where you find, this would be modern Iraq, about 800 miles from Jerusalem, in the town that we now know of as Mosul. Sitting by the Tigris River is the capital of Assyria, called Nineveh of Jonah fame. All right? This, for a couple hundred years, Nineveh was extremely important, and for at least 50 years, it was the largest city in the world. Thanks in no small part to British colonialism, we actually have an excellent record of ancient Assyria. Like if you go to the British Museum in London today, they have taken entire rooms out of the ancient Assyrian palaces, and they've transported them to London, and now you can view the whole rooms in air-conditioned pleasure. It's amazing. So guys like, you might have heard these names, Tiglath-Pileser, Ashurbanipal, Sennacherib, Sargon, these epic kings. They're variously mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures, but all of this really predates the time of Daniel. Just below Nineveh, 300 miles south, and sitting directly on top of the Euphrates River in the plain of Shinar is a place called Babylon. Now, we first hear of Babylon in Genesis chapter 11, where it says, and I quote, "As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar, and they settled there, and they took this new technology called the brick, and they decided to build this tower, where they were going to build this tower all the way to the heavens, and they themselves were going to have this place where they could once again be with God, meet God, have a direct access to God, called the Tower of Babel. And this town, Babylon, becomes known as the place for the human attempt to control or become like God. So, for a time, Babylon would become the greatest city in the world. This is during the time of Daniel. Ancient historians would describe it as like one of the wonders of the ancient world. We have, again, at the British Museum, all kinds of artifacts from it. The walls there were supposedly thick enough that you could drive two chariots side by side all the way up and down them, and it went for miles around. There's some discrepancy over how thick they were, but they were enormous. And remember, this is sitting in the middle of the desert, so you have this tall, gleaming city rising out of the desert right over top of the Euphrates River. We actually have a lot of the bricks from that were preserved and saved. You can go to the British Museum and find bricks with Nebuchadnezzar's name on it because he wanted to personally sign everyone. But they took some of these bricks, and these bricks would be finished with a shiny blue finish, and then they artfully put images of lions and things like that on it. They've reconstructed some of these in Berlin, of all places, and you have the ancient Ishtar Gate. This is a reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate from the original bricks in ancient Babylon. So this gives you a sense, that people, this is something like 50 feet high. It's massive, it's immense, it's impressive. Everyone who saw it was just wowed by it. Now, Babylon, just to give you a sense of this, they pretty much defeated everyone in the world in their day, which gave them a source of endless wealth. So have you ever heard about in Dubai where their sheiks built a ski resort in the middle of the desert? That kind of wealth, kind of like, wow, stupid wealth. That's what ancient Babylon was like. You can go there today. My friend, well, actually, you shouldn't go there today. You'll probably get killed. But at one point, you could go there. After the Iraq War, my friend worked there, and he got to wander around the ancient ruins. And you might remember Saddam Hussein tried to rebuild part of that as his palace because he thought he was Nebuchadnezzar resurrected or something. I've heard, though, that the actual Ishtar Gate, which is there, was destroyed in 2016 by ISIS. Can't confirm that, but anyways, terrible stuff. So, Babylonian Empire, though. While the Babylonian Empire is actually kind of short-lived, it makes quite an impression. So, in the scriptures, the name Babylon becomes this shorthand for the human attempt to become like God and set up your own kingdom apart from God. So, historic Babylon will fade into the rubble of history, but the name Babylon lives on. So long as humans are attempting to become like God, Babylon lives. This is why you see the city of Babylon mentioned in the book of Revelation. These three superpowers, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, they are going to be the superpowers that rule the ancient Near East for hundreds of years, and right in the middle, stuck right between these warring giants, is little Israel. Now, as far as Daniel is concerned, we kind of pick up the story in 605 BC. Prior to that, for like hundreds of years prior to that, the Assyrians had dominated everything, conquered at will. In fact, in 722 BC, they had conquered northern Israel, which was Samaria. The capital was Samaria. They'd come in and ravaged it, destroyed the people. These were the 10 northern tribes out of the 12 tribes of Israel. The 10 northern tribes, they were centered in Samaria. This is why you'll hear of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. So the Assyrians came in and they so ravaged them, they basically wiped them off the face of the earth. They bred them out. This is where the only remnants you'll find of them are what you find in the New Testament referred to as Samaritans. All right? During that same siege, just to give you a sense of what was happening, Judah still remained where the capital of Jerusalem was, but they were absolutely terrified. And you can read in Isaiah how God miraculously preserves them, but they're absolutely terrified, and for good reason. We have, again, if you go to the British Museum, you have these reliefs that capture like the siege works and how they would go and conquer a city. And there's one of Lachish, which is just 30 miles from ancient Jerusalem, what the Assyrians did in Lachish. And if you look at this close up, my own picture, so it's a little blurry, you can see that they were famous for impaling people. That they would set up these poles, and while everyone's surrounded and stuck inside that city, they would set up these poles and they would capture people, stick them on the pole, still alive, the pole's going through their body, and let them die in front of everyone just to terrify and terrorize everyone. The Assyrians were great at killing foreign people. Unfortunately, they were not great at ruling foreign people. So they found themselves, what you find in ancient history is you find that they have to fight these battles again and again and again with the same peoples because they can't figure out how to rule them. They can only know how to defeat them. Most famously, they fought and defeated, came down to Babylon at least 6 times that we know of. They came down and defeated the Babylonians again and again and again. But then on the 7th time, a guy named Nabopolassar started a revolt, pulled off the seemingly impossible, and he broke through the Assyrian siege. And then he marched up to Nineveh and actually broke through their walls. And then Egypt hears about this, and they don't want that. They have had enough problems with Assyria. They don't want this Babylonian empire coming down. So they come up, they join the remaining Assyrian forces and say, we're going to put an end to this Babylon thing. And in 605 BC, the world has changed. At the Battle of Carchemish, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, the greatest forces of the ancient Near East all come together, and Nabopolassar's son, you may have heard of him, Nebuchadnezzar, defeats them all After that moment, there is literally nothing in the world to stop Nebuchadnezzar from doing what he wants. You can read about this in Ezekiel chapter 30. He breaks the arm of Pharaoh and begins what we know as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So with Assyria and Egypt out of the way, there's no one to stop Nebuchadnezzar. He will build, at the time, the greatest kingdom in the world, and he would easily become one of the most powerful people, not only at the time, but in the history of the world. And he knew it. And he knew it. So we have this gem at the Met. You can go see this. It's this little cuneiform cylinder where you would press it into clay and roll it out, and it would have a message for you. What does this message say? Well, this message is from Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, "What no king has done before, I did. I built a strong wall that cannot be shaken. I laid its foundation on the breast of the netherworld. And I built its top as high as a mountain. I completed Babylon." He was great, and he knew it. So shortly after the Battle of Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar then, from the Battle of Carchemish, comes down, and he wants to basically subjugate the entire ancient Near East. And he builds an empire unlike the world has ever seen. Right? He takes over the entire thing. And in doing so, he goes down and sets up puppet kings and takes tribute from different places. And then he goes and he takes the elite, the ruling class, the professionals from all the various people groups and brings them back to Babylon. Now get this. This is really important here. Unlike the Assyrians, the Babylonians weren't just experts at killing people. They were experts at empire building. They knew that the best way to overcome their enemies was not to repeatedly destroy them, but to give them a cushy Babylonian job. Set them up in a Babylonian house. Teach them how to eat Babylonian cuisine. Send their kindergartners home with the best Babylonian propaganda. They would bring an end to their enemies once for all by turning them into Babylonians. It was a different kind of war, one fought with words, with ideas, with values, with songs, with media. But make no mistake, it was an act of war. So, in the fall of 605 BC, something like 10,000 young professionals from Jerusalem, right in this area, were then sent up to Babylon for the Babylonian re-education program. More on that next week. Over the next couple decades, there would be several different deportations back to Babylon. You can read about these and all the political intrigue around them in 2 Kings. Then finally, after Zedekiah tries to throw a rebellion, tries to go back to get Egypt on his side and break free, Nebuchadnezzar won't take it anymore. In 586-87 BC, he comes, sieges Jerusalem, razes the walls, slaughters thousands, burns the temple to the ground, hauls the sacred things of God back to Babylon along with a few thousand Jews. Now, here's the situation we're in the book of Daniel. Try to imagine this. We actually know the location. It's the Kebar Canal, just outside of ancient Babylon. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and we wept when we remembered Zion. The unthinkable has happened. The promised land's been taken. Your king is in chains. God's temple's been burned to the ground. Only a remnant, only a few of God's people even exist anymore. The Babylonians are literally reprogramming all of your leaders in their Babylonian ways. It is impossible to overstate the existential threat to faith and to their very identity at this point. It looks like this is going to be the end, that Judaism, that faith in God is going to go the way of worship of Zeus or Poseidon or something. Another dead religion. And in that moment of desperation, they ask, what do we do? How do we be the people of God in Babylon? How do we walk with God in the city of men? And Jeremiah speaks up. So Jeremiah chapter 27, 28, 29, we have a record of this. And there are some prophets there, particularly a guy named Hananiah, who his message is this. His message is what you need to do is stay out there on the canal of Kebar. Don't go into Babylon. Don't have anything to do with it. Pray against them. If you just hold out, stay away, hold your breath. In 2 years, Babylon's going to fall. Babylon is going to fall. They're the enemy. Pray against them. But Jeremiah, he hears something different from God. He hears that they are going to be there for 70 years. And so he picks up a pen and he writes this letter. He's still back in Jerusalem, but he writes this letter to the exiles in Babylon, and this is how he starts. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens, eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace, the shalom, the wholeness, the health, and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you. I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for if it prospers, you too will prosper. So his letter goes on, but the two main points echo through really, really clearly. The first is this. God says, this is my doing. I sent you there. This didn't just happen. This isn't the work of the Babylonians. At one point, he actually calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant. He serves me. Losing your cultural influence, becoming impoverished, having no control over your very lives, not knowing if you'll meet at church next week because the pandemic might break out, being dropped into Babylon. God says, that was my plan. I'm the one who did this, and this is how I'm going to transform you and how I'm going to work in Babylon. And this, when God said, this is my plan, this is the context for one of the most famous verses in the Bible. You may have heard it. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. For 70 years in Babylon. So number one, God says, this is my plan. And number two, you must refuse to choose between assimilation or separation. He says there's another way. Keep your identity as God's people. Remain faithful to God, but do it for the sake of the city. Bless the city. Pray for the city. Make it prosper. Seek the shalom, the health of the city. Integrate, but don't give up your identity. Get a job, build a house, raise kids, be part of the city, but don't forget your true home. Learn the values and ideas of the city, but don't lose the truth of God's word. Be in the world, but not of the world. Now, if Jeremiah had just said what Hananiah said, hey, become Amish, stay outside the city, never integrate, stay away from those bad people and that bad culture, it would have been so much easier. But Hananiah is a false prophet, and God kills him. Jeremiah's message, on the other hand, is true, but it's not easy. It's difficult, it's messy, it requires immense wisdom. So how do we do this? How do we live and work and raise kids in Babylon without becoming Babylonian, to which God seems to be answering? Daniel chapter 1 through 6. We have every reason to believe that Daniel actually read this letter. He actually quotes it in chapter 9, or references it. These stories are the stories. The stories of Daniel are the stories of God's people seeking God's wisdom and trying to live. How do we live? How do we do this? How do we do this? So in Daniel, in the history of Daniel, we find this historic moment where Daniel becomes for us a model of wisdom for all who are trying to figure out how to walk with God in the city of men. That is the historic context of Daniel, and that is why we need to read Daniel today. That's the history. Number two, prophecy, though. The second half of Daniel reads quite different. It's this series of visions and interpretations that in some detail give the order of kings and kingdoms that will rise and fall preceding the kingdom of God. Remember, the exiles, they had lost everything. They don't know if they're going to possibly make it. They desperately need to know that God is still in control, that history isn't chaotic, that history is headed somewhere, that it's leading to someone. And over this, God speaks. He reveals that Babylon is not in control, that he's in control. That Babylon would not be the end of God's people, but that Babylon was being used just as every other human kingdom will be, willingly or unwillingly, towards his ends, and ultimately his kingdom will stand. Now, that's the point of the prophecies of Daniel, and I really wish I could just leave it there. But there's a problem. Daniel's prophecies are extremely precise and accurate, and at times interpreted for us. In fact, about 100 years before the time of Jesus Christ, the Essenes, this group of Jewish mystics who kind of lived out in the desert and were kind of crazy, they read the book of Daniel and they predicted that Messiah would come sometime between 3 BC and 2 AD, just reading the book of Daniel. Like I said, it's precise. But here's where the problem comes in. If I don't believe that God actually reveals future to people, this is a problem, because here are these prophecies of Daniel staring me in the face. So enter Porphyry. Porphyry in the 2nd century AD was a Greek philosopher, writer, and remember, Christianity is just now spreading across the Roman Empire, and he does not like this. He doesn't like where it's headed, and he's this scholar. He writes on various things from like philosophy to music theory to vegetarianism. And he decides to write against these Christians. He literally writes a series of 15 books called Against the Christians. And in that, he postulates a theory. He says, the book of Daniel was not written by a 6th century Hebrew. It was written in 164 BC by someone pretending to be Daniel. Now, why 164 BC? Because Daniel outlines in chapters 10 and 11 some very, very specific historic details that are going to be completed in 164 BC. So he assumes someone in 164 BC was writing this. They looked back on history and pretended like it was prophecy. That's why it's so accurate. Now, a number of early Christians answered Porphyry's objections, Jerome most famously, arguing that there's all kinds of evidence that in fact Daniel was written much earlier, included eyewitness accounts from the 6th century man Daniel, and for the next 1,600 years of the church, Christianity everywhere, that's what people believed until the 1800s. And there are some Germans who take a scientific post-Enlightenment approach to the study of scriptures known as higher criticism. And they go in and they revive and expand Porphyry's theories here. They argue that Daniel was written in 164 BC by someone pretending to be Daniel, and they go on to say the person Daniel never actually existed. He was a righteous myth, an ideal Israelite created to encourage the Jewish people. And this theory then goes on and gets embraced because it's rational and scientific and logical. It gets embraced by all the leading schools, Harvard, Yale, blah, 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 blah. Then, though, some linguists started looking at Daniel, and they're like, wait a second. Whole sections of Daniel are written in what's called Imperial Aramaic, which we'll talk about here in a second. But Imperial Aramaic stopped being used in the 300s BC. Like almost 200 years before you're saying that Daniel was written. How would a book be written in a language that hasn't been used in 200 years? That's strange. And then in 1947, they discovered at Qumran, these Dead Sea Scrolls, this huge, vast library of all these texts from the ancient world. And in that, the book of the Bible, the most copies of any book of the Bible that they find in these Dead Sea Scrolls is the book of Daniel, included among the ancient Hebrew scriptures. This leads to all kinds of technical debates over text and language and things. And today, where we find ourselves is conservative scholars will argue that Daniel is in fact written in the 6th century, while progressive scholars at like Harvard and Yale and will generally argue that yes, portions of Daniel were written in some previous time, but then the final form of the book, particularly the prophecies, were all written in 164 AD and added in after the fact. Now, this is a great debate within the theological world, and let me be clear. The date of Daniel is not a measure of whether you're a follower of Jesus or not. Jesus is. That's how that works, right? All right, just to be clear, following Jesus is what matters. So if you've watched a PBS special and you're just absolutely sure that you now know all this about the ancient Near East and Daniel was written in 164 BC, great. There's space for you here. You are welcome here. We're going to have some fun conversations along the way. Let me just say that's not where I land. As I look at the evidence, and as I look at what Christians have believed down through the ages, there is literary, textual, theological, and archaeological reason to believe that the book of Daniel does, in fact, capture firsthand experiences of ancient Hebrew exiles living in Babylon from the 6th century BC. Now, in the end, what you will find, though, is where you fall on the date of Daniel seems less to do with the data and more to do with your presuppositions. Do you believe God has revealed himself in human history? Or does that make you really, really uncomfortable? That's really the question. If you grant that this, in fact, may be a 6th century prophecy, then it's awesome. Then it's humbling. If, in fact, when you realize what you're holding in your hands, it should send shivers up your spine. And this brings me to the second way in which we need to read the book of Daniel. And we need to read our lives in awe and humility. The author of history cares enough about us to explain what he's doing, to show us what he is doing in all things. Or to say it a bit more starkly, we do not need to wonder whether we'll end up on the wrong side of history because we know the author of history and he's told us where it's headed. That is what the prophecy of Daniel shows us. And last, apocalypse. So apocalypse, perhaps the most notable thing about the book of Daniel for any original reader is the least noticeable thing for all of us. And it's that Daniel was written in 2 languages. It starts out in Hebrew, speaking good Hebrew that you would speak, Jews spoke, the Hebrew people spoke, the people of God, that language. And then in chapter 2, verse 4, one of Nebuchadnezzar's officials starts speaking, and he speaks in Imperial Aramaic, which was just the common language. Everyone spoke that language there. So he starts speaking in that language, and then the story continues on like that until the end of chapter 7, and then it goes back to Hebrew. So my brother married an Albanian, which Albania is just like this tiny little country in Eastern Europe, and very, very, very few people actually in the world globally speak Albanian. So what they've found is that they have basically a secret language that no one knows. So if they're in public and they want to say something private to each other, they just switch. They start speaking Albanian to each other. So if they're speaking Albanian, they're probably talking about you or sharing secrets. Right? You're like, hey, knock that stuff out. That's what this feels like. There are parts of Daniel that are written for the whole world to hear. Imperial Aramaic. Everybody read this. Come hear this, come hear this. But there are sections that seem to be like a private conversation. Daniel has something to share, but he's not sure everyone's ready to hear it. It's like, hey, if you don't know God yet, this might be really weird. I'm going to pull the veil back on some things. We're going to get a glimpse of some things that if you don't know God yet, this is going to become really uncomfortable, because we're going to talk about spiritual forces at work in and under socio-political, economic, religious realities. And not everyone's ready to see that. We're going to talk about angels and demons and spiritual forces. Now, we modern scientific post-Enlightenment people, we really have no categories for this. We might, conjure up some images of Final Judgment, Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel, and demons dragging you off to hell. Or maybe when you were a teenager, you watched The Exorcist and imagine someone projectile vomiting and levitating things. I don't know what you picture. I'm not sure all of these are entirely wrong, but that's not what I want you to imagine today. When we start this conversation, particularly about Daniel and the apocalypse, here's where I want to start. I want to start with what we do understand. So imagine you wake up tomorrow morning and you're like, oh, I have a TV appearance to make. Right? You get all dressed up. Or no, you're going to show up in a big boardroom at a shareholders meeting. Or you're going to go to a major university, Villanova or something like that, and you're going to speak. And your text, when you get up there to speak, you're all dressed up, ready for this. You look into the camera, and then you say, God made us male and female. Gender is biological and God-given. Thank you. Now, what will happen when you do that? What happened? That might very well end your career, in relationships, change the trajectory of your life, get you canceled. If you have any questions, just ask Dave Trevell. So here's the question. Here's the question I want you to ponder. This American cultural reality, which we all know is quite real and quite powerful, what exactly is it? What is it that threatens you? What is it that is threatening you, that is so powerful that you're afraid to say those words? There's no thing. You can't pick it up and say, here it is. This is what canceled me. There's no thing. It's not a physical reality. It's an unseen reality. You might say it's just an idea. And yet this idea is reshaping our world, our educational system, our language, and for some of us, literally reshaping our bodies. This unseen reality has real power to coerce, power to control, to dominate, to command, to reward. If it's threatened, it will fight back. If it's supported, it will richly reward you. This unseen reality is bigger than any one person, even a group of people. It seems to have a life of its own, a will of its own. And when the apostles and prophets see that reality in our world, that unseen reality that we all feel, we all know, we know it's here, they name it. So the Apostle Paul, writing to the Ephesians, describes these unseen ideas that wield such authority and power in this way. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's not against people. It's not against pundits. It's not against news networks. It's not against media moguls. But against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. That according to the scriptures, political, economic, educational, ideological, religious systems of our world are not just human ideas. Capitalism, democracy, Marxism, liberalism, conservatism, critical race theory, evangelicalism. Pretty much anything with an ism at the end. These are human systems. These are human ideologies that have a natural, a historic, a bent, a tendency to take on a life of their own, to be animated. And the Apostle Paul and Jesus and John and Daniel will call these spiritual forces. They will call them, Galatians chapter 4, basic or elemental forces that are in and under and behind these ideas, and they name them, we know them as demons. So, in fact, they argue that spiritual forces are what animate and give such power and personality and authority to these ideas. In the Old Testament, this was much, much more explicit. So each nation had their own small g god, and it was really, really clear. Like there was the god of Assyria and the god of Babylon and the god of Egypt. And if you threaten their gods, if you threaten their socioeconomic, political, educational systems, their god fought back, right? And if their God beat you, then they would take your God and bring them and make them subject to their God. In the book of Daniel, all of this gets radically exposed. The veil gets pulled back. And when we look at kingdoms of this earth, when we look at the powers, human ideologies, when we look at Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, America, they're exposed for what they really are. Demonic, satanic, and beastly, apart from submission to God and his kingdom. Which is not to say that all social, political, economic, religious systems and ideologies are satanic. Just most of them. The point, Daniel's point, my point, the Apostle Paul's point, is that we need to be more discerning. We need to know the spirit in and under and behind certain ideas. Ideas aren't just ideas. They want to enslave you. They want to control you. They have an agenda. Not as unwise, but as wise, for the days are evil. Discerning, and I don't mean by discerning that we need to call the Ghostbusters to detect paranormal activity. I mean discerning, whether it be republicanism or critical race theory. Both can be used, both can be ideas that are taken, that are animated by something evil, by something enslaving, by something destructive. We must discern whether what they're doing, what they stand for, truly aligns with the kingdom of God or not, which gives us a different perspective, not just on culture, but on those who are perpetuating culture, be it Babylonian or American. Get this, and this is maybe the key. They are not the enemy. They've been taken captive by the enemy. And there's a world of difference. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's not against the people. It's not against the teachers. It's not against the educational system. It's not against the government. It's not against those people. They don't need to be defeated. They need to be set free. They need to know Jesus. They need to come into alignment with God's kingdom. They need to be invited in. They need to be redeemed so that the city of men can finally become the city of God. So how do we walk with God in the city of men? These three frames answer our question: history, prophecy, apocalypse. Number one, it requires wisdom. And Daniel is our model, which we'll follow through in the weeks to come. Number two, it requires trusting God that he has a plan for history when history feels out of control. That's the prophecy piece. And number three, it requires discernment, for the days are evil. Next week, chapter 1. Let's pray. Father, I do thank you for your goodness to us. I thank you for the book of Daniel. I thank you that you did come after us and you didn't leave us in this, Lord. But you came after us. You revealed not only history to us, but you revealed your heart for us, that you've invited us into a relationship with you, and you've revealed your heart for the whole world. That God, this world that is evil and bent upon itself, you say you love this world. In fact, you so love this world that you sent your only son to die on the cross, that whoever would believe in him will not perish but have eternal life. God, and that is my only hope for me and for our world. I pray that you give us courage to walk in that today. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.